"Sir, I can save your son," said the poor boy to the millionaire at the hospital. Harborview, a coastal town in Massachusetts, wakes up every day to the distant cries of seagulls and the biting cold rolling in from the Atlantic. Perched on the hilltop, St. Matthew's Medical Center is the heart of local medical life, a place of hope for some and farewell for others. Within its corridors, two worlds that rarely meet are about to collide. On one side is Ethan Caldwell, a millionaire used to quick answers and problems solved with money. On the other is Lucas Rivera, a poor 9-year-old boy from East Dockside, who visits his grandmother in a vegetative state every single day. Lucas has come to know every step, every voice, and every glance within the hospital. When Oliver, Ethan's 10-year-old son, is admitted with a mysterious illness, even the most renowned doctors fail to find the cause. That's when Lucas, armed only with observation and courage, decides to approach the most powerful man he has ever seen with a simple yet impossible to ignore sentence. "Sir, I can save your son." From that unlikely encounter, a story of secrets, bravery, and loyalty will begin to change the lives of all three forever. Like the video, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Winter in Harborview showed no mercy. Gusts of wind from the Atlantic cut through the narrow streets like icy blades, and the gray sky seemed lower than usual, pressing down on old brick buildings and darkened shop windows. At the top of the hill, the St. Matthew's Medical Center stood with its glass facades reflecting a timid sun, promising warmth only inside its heated corridors. Ethan Caldwell crossed the main lobby with his overcoat open, tie loosened, and deep circles under his eyes. He went straight up to room 412, where his son, Oliver, had been hospitalized for 4 days. The 10-year-old boy lay under a blue blanket, his face pale and feverish, hooked up to monitors tracking every heartbeat and breath. Experienced doctors came and went, making notes, ordering tests, but no definitive diagnosis emerged. The fever came and went as if following a cruel script. Rashes appeared and faded, and the fatigue seemed to grow by the hour. Ethan, used to solving corporate crises with speed, felt more powerless than ever. His money and connections couldn't give him an immediate answer. In the long-term care ward, a few floors below, Lucas Rivera arrived for the routine he repeated every day. He wore the same worn-out sweatshirt, scuffed sneakers, and carried a light backpack slung over one shoulder. He passed reception and got a quiet nod from a nurse who knew him well. He walked to bed 23, where his grandmother, Martha Rivera, had lain motionless since a stroke 2 years earlier. The steady sound of the ventilator filled the air, and soft light highlighted her gray hair. Lucas adjusted the floral blanket over her, carefully wiped down the bedside table, and began talking about what he'd seen on the way. Boats leaving the dock before sunrise, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the corner bakery, seagulls fighting over scraps of fish. He spoke, as if she could hear him, and maybe she could. When he finished, he sat in silence, watching the hallway, alert to faces, gestures, and half-finished conversations. Over time, he'd learned to pick up on signs others ignored. Lucas knew the hospital better than most. He knew when the medication carts rolled by, when coffee was served to visitors, which elevators stayed less busy, and which doctors spoke loudly on the phone. That was how, that morning, he overheard something that made him stop. 2 nurses were talking about a complicated pediatric case, a 10-year-old boy with persistent fever, skin rashes, and inconclusive tests. The description set off an alarm in his mind. He had noted at least 3 similar cases in his notebook in recent months. The symptoms, the sequence, it all matched. He didn't understand all the medical terms, but he recognized patterns, like seeing pieces of a puzzle repeat themselves. He knew no one would listen to him on his own, but this was something he couldn't keep to himself. Without overthinking it, he decided to head up to the pediatric floor, something he did from time to time just to see what was going on when he wasn't with his grandmother. When he reached the pediatric corridor, he noticed the atmosphere there was different, quieter, more tense. Ethan Caldwell was walking out of room 412, adjusting his coat and glancing distractedly at his phone. Lucas recognized him not by name, but by the posture and expensive suit that didn't belong in a place like this. He had seen the man on TV and in magazines, and he knew he wasn't just anybody. For a moment, the boy hesitated, but realized this might be his only chance. He walked slowly, clutching his notebook to his chest, and waited until the hallway cleared. Ethan stopped in front of the coffee machine, unaware of the boy's approach. That's when Lucas spoke, his voice low but firm. "Sir, I can save your son." The words hung in the air, heavy and improbable. Ethan looked up, startled, meeting a pair of steady eyes that didn't look away. "What did you say?" Ethan asked, frowning in confusion. Lucas calmly repeated, "I can save your son." Before the man could respond, he began explaining that he visited his grandmother every day and had seen other children with symptoms identical to Oliver's. He talked about the intermittent fever, the rashes, the exhaustion. He mentioned that he wrote everything down in his notebook and could prove it. Ethan narrowed his eyes, skeptical, and asked why he should believe him. Lucas answered without hesitation, "Because I've seen this before and nobody listened." His tone was simple, without drama, but full of certainty. For a moment, Ethan considered brushing him off, but something about the boy's confidence made him pause. He asked to see what he had. Lucas motioned for him to follow to a small break room at the end of the hall. They sat across from each other, and the boy opened his notebook, revealing pages filled with dates, initials, and detailed symptom descriptions written with the focus of someone who noticed everything. "I don't understand it all, but they all took the same allergy medicine before they got worse," he said, pointing to a word written in capital letters, Alarix. The name hit Ethan like a blow. He knew that drug. It was made by Medcore Therapeutics, the pharmaceutical arm of Northbridge Global, his own conglomerate. The weight of the revelation sank hard. If it was true, it wasn't just his son's life at risk, but potentially many others, along with the reputation of his entire company. Lucas closed the notebook and slipped it into his backpack. "I can show you someone who knows more. She used to work here, but was fired for trying to warn people about this. Nurse Evelyn Price. She has proof." Ethan hesitated for a few seconds. Every instinct told him not to follow a stranger, much less a boy who looked like he might live on the streets. But when he glanced back toward room 412 and imagined Oliver getting worse, the choice became clear. "Where is she?" he asked in a low voice. "East Dockside." "I can take you," Lucas replied matter-of-factly. For the first time that day, Ethan felt that the only real lead to saving his son might be in the hands of someone he never would have noticed, if not for that one sentence still echoing in his head. Ethan took a deep breath before answering. There was a strangely steady conviction in the boy's voice, but following someone he barely knew into a neighborhood he'd only heard about in headlines for violence was not a trivial decision. Lucas, however, didn't seem rushed or eager to persuade him. He simply waited, backpack on his shoulders, hands in the sweatshirt pocket. "We need to leave without drawing attention," the boy said, glancing around. Ethan gave a quick nod and excused himself to return to room 412 for a moment. He stepped inside quietly, touched Oliver's arm, and whispered that he'd be back soon. When he came out, Lucas was already by the service elevator. They went down to the ground floor through a route that bypassed the main lobby. At the side exit, the biting wind from the harbor made Ethan pull his coat tighter around himself. "Is it far?" he asked. "Depends." By car, it's quick. Walking takes a while, Lucas replied, as if he'd made the trip dozens of times. Ethan pulled out his phone and called his driver, asking him to come to the hospital's side street without pulling up to the main entrance. While they waited, Lucas discreetly nodded toward a passing bus. That works too, but the car will be safer. The black sedan pulled up within minutes, its windows fogged from the cold. Ethan opened the back door and motioned for Lucas to get in first. The boy slid into the corner, watching everything with an attention that seemed less like childish curiosity and more like survival instinct. East Dockside near the old bridge, Warehouse Street, red brick building with a peeling blue door, he instructed. The driver shot a quick look in the mirror, clearly recognizing the area, and accelerated. As the car left the city center, the scenery shifted. Warm shop fronts gave way to crumbling facades. Bars shuttered even in daylight. Damp streets with puddles reflecting the gray sky. Ethan looked out the window, feeling like he was crossing an invisible border within his own city. Lucas, on the other hand, seemed to relax the closer they got to the neighborhood. "That's the market where I get cheap bread when I've got extra money," he said without hesitation. Ethan didn't comment, but he noted every detail. When they crossed the low bridge over the canal, the smell of salt water grew stronger, mixed with oil and rust. The car turned left into a narrow street lined with old warehouses. Lucas asked to be dropped off before they reached their destination. "Better not stop right out front. A lot of people here don't like unexpected visitors." Ethan agreed and stepped out with him. They walked the last few yards to a two-story building with reddish bricks and tall windows, its blue paint on the door worn away by time and sea air. Lucas knocked 3 times, leaving a longer pause between the second and third knock. Inside, they heard the sound of a chain being unlatched. The door opened just enough to reveal a middle-aged woman, hair pulled back in a simple bun, eyes sharp. "Lucas?" she asked, surprised. "I need you to talk to him," the boy said, nodding toward Ethan. She hesitated for a moment, then opened the door and stepped aside. They climbed a narrow flight of stairs to a room lit by the cold daylight coming through the windows. A wooden table sat in the center, covered with papers and folders, while an electric heater hummed in the corner. "I'm Evelyn Price," the woman said, offering her hand to Ethan. Ethan shook her hand and got straight to the point. "My son's in St. Matthews. He's got a fever, rash, and severe fatigue. Lucas says you know something about similar cases." Evelyn looked at the boy, then at Ethan, choosing her words carefully. "I know more than I should," she said, walking to a shelf and pulling down a thick folder. "In recent months, I've seen at least 10 children with the exact same pattern of symptoms. All of them were taking a medication called Alarix." Ethan's stomach tightened. The name landed like a direct accusation. Evelyn went on. "I was head nurse in the pediatric unit. I started recording everything: dates, doses, reactions. I took it to the internal committee. They ignored me. I took it to the medical director. A week later, I was fired." Ethan flipped through the pages. Patient files coded by initials, progress charts, meticulous notes. "Does the drugs manufacturer know?" he asked. "If they don't, it's because they don't want to," she replied. Lucas stayed silent, leaning against the wall, his eyes following every page Ethan turned. "Why didn't you go to the press?" he asked, breaking the silence. Evelyn let out a short breath. "Without complete, documented proof, they could discredit me and sue for defamation. I needed something solid, and now I have it. But I can't go public without protection." Ethan slowly closed the folder. "Medcore Therapeutics makes Alarix. Medcore is owned by Northbridge Global, and Northbridge is mine." The weight of the admission hung in the air. Lucas looked away, as if not wanting to intrude on the moment, but Evelyn held her gaze steady. Then you have two choices. Close your eyes and protect the company, or protect your son and every other child. Ethan knew which one he'd choose, but he also knew every step from here on out would carry enormous consequences. Evelyn gathered a few documents and placed them in a brown envelope. Take this. It's not everything, but it shows a pattern. Keep it safe, and keep Lucas away from certain people at the hospital. He's already drawn too much attention. The boy frowned but didn't argue. Ethan slipped the envelope into his coat and thanked her. I'll be in touch later today. I'll need more information. Evelyn gave a short nod. When they stepped outside, the cold east dockside wind hit Ethan's face harder, as if reminding him he'd just stepped into dangerous territory. Lucas adjusted his backpack and looked up at him. Now what? It took Ethan a few seconds to answer. Now, we save my son. They walked back to the car in silence, each absorbing the weight of what had just happened. For Ethan, the race against time had just taken on a new pace. The trip back to St. Matthew's was made in silence. The brown envelope with Evelyn's evidence rested securely in the inner pocket of Ethan's overcoat, and every step he took down the hallway felt steadier than when he had left. He went straight to the nurse's station on the pediatric floor and asked to speak with Dr. Richard Hawley. Minutes later, the doctor appeared, lab coat pristine, clipboard in hand, wearing the look of someone ready to deliver the same rehearsed speech. Before he could start, Ethan pulled out Oliver's medication record and pointed directly to the name that had already become central: Alarix. I want this medication stopped immediately, he said, in a tone that left no room for debate. Hawley tried to bring up protocols and lack of conclusive evidence, but Ethan cut him off. He explained that an external review would begin immediately and that, until then, only supportive treatment was authorized. He demanded the order be entered into the chart and signed by both of them right there at the desk. Reluctantly, the doctor signed. From a distance, Lucas watched the scene, clutching his notebook to his chest, as if each word were a move in the chess game he had helped set in motion. As soon as Hawley stepped away, Ethan called a contact in Boston, requesting the immediate arrival of two independent specialists in pediatric immunology and toxicology. The conversation was short and to the point. He wanted his own analysis, free from hospital interference. When he hung up, he asked the head nurse to make sure every sample taken from Oliver was preserved and labeled. Lucas, still standing at the doorway, came closer to say he was heading back to his grandmother's ward. Ethan, looking at the boy, realized how much trust he was placing in this moment and replied, "Don't worry, we're not stopping now." The words weren't just meant to reassure. They had already become a promise, one that inside him was solidifying into a mission. Back in the room, he sat beside his son's bed, watching him sleep with a little less tension in his face, and felt that the first piece had been moved in the right direction. Hours later, the two specialists arrived, carrying exam kits and laptops. Ethan personally escorted them to Oliver's room, introduced them to Hawley, and demanded full cooperation. The air in the hallway grew heavier, with uneasy glances from some of the staff. While the specialists spoke in technical terms, Lucas appeared again, this time holding a cup of coffee for Ethan. Got it downstairs. It's strong, he said simply, as if this small gesture were his way of taking part. Ethan accepted it, thanked him, and told him to stay nearby but out of any conversations that might pull him into the center of the problem. Lucas nodded, though the glint in his eyes made it clear he was absorbing every detail. As he left, he passed Hawley, who gave him a quick up and down look before moving on. The first round of tests confirmed what Evelyn had suspected. Oliver was showing an inflammatory reaction consistent with adverse effects from Alarix. The specialists explained they'd need genetic testing to confirm any predisposition, but that removing the medication immediately was the safest course. Ethan authorized it on the spot, reinforcing the decision already in the chart. Later, while speaking with the outside doctors in the hallway, Lucas appeared quietly. I saw a man with a visitor's badge talking to Dr. Hawley at the far end, near the service elevator. He had a black folder and kept looking around, he reported. Ethan filed that away, realizing the boy had indeed become an essential set of eyes in all of this. When night fell, Ethan stepped into an empty room to make a call he had been putting off. He dialed Northbridge Global's executive board. The meeting was brief but explosive. He informed them of serious suspicions about Alarix and ordered an immediate halt to its production and distribution until a full audit was complete on the day on the Valesian. Other end, pushback came in the form of arguments about financial impact, brand image, and the need for definitive reports. Ethan didn't waver. If my son nearly died because of this product, any child in the world could be at risk, and as long as I'm in charge, this will not continue. Hanging up, he knew he had just opened another front in the fight, this time against part of the very company he had built. Back in room 412, he found Oliver awake, more alert than he had been in hours. The boy gave him a faint smile, and Ethan sat beside him. They spoke only briefly, but it was enough for Oliver to say he was hungry, a promising sign. Lucas reappeared, holding 2 sandwiches, handing one to Oliver and the other to Ethan, as if it were simply part of the routine. For the first time since the hospitalization began, Ethan felt a real thread of hope. But he knew that to keep it, he'd have to keep facing forces that valued silence over solutions. And looking at the boy who had brought him the first answers, he understood that Lucas was now as much a part of this fight as he was. Ethan returned to the hospital with his mind racing. Evelyn's words echoed as if they had been recorded in his memory. He went straight up to Oliver's room and found his son sitting up, flipping through a storybook, a promising sign. When he saw his father, the boy gave a shy smile. "I think I'm feeling better today," he said, his voice still weak. Ethan sat beside him, running his hand through his son's hair, feeling relief mingle with urgency. There was no time to waste. He explained in simple terms that he had found someone who could help, someone who knew what was really going on. Oliver listened quietly, but his attention shifted to the small figure appearing in the doorway. Lucas, with his warm backpack slung over his shoulders, watching them as if waiting for a signal to come in. Ethan gave a nod, and the boy stepped closer, holding a notebook even more battered than the day before. "I wrote down names people I've seen going in and out of MedCore's testing wing. I don't think they're here to visit regular patients," he said with quiet certainty. The notes were more detailed than Ethan expected times. Partial names, physical descriptions. Lucas had a sharp eye for detail, and it showed in how he described these people's behavior. Ethan knew he had to act quickly, but he also needed to gauge how far he could trust the boy. Evelyn's warning still rang in his head. The more they know you're investigating, the faster they'll react. Caution told him to pull back, but the image of Oliver lying in that bed erased any hesitation. He told Lucas to keep watch for unusual activity at the hospital, but not to approach anyone. "You can tell me everything, but don't talk to strangers about this," he emphasized. The boy nodded, tucking the notebook away carefully, as if it were his most valuable possession. That same night, Ethan called a meeting with Northbridge Global's senior leadership. The 38th floor conference room overlooked Harborview's harbor, but no one was paying attention to the view. The executive sat stiffly, and the tension only grew when he laid some of Evelyn's documents on the table, along with Lucas's notes. "Alarix is causing serious adverse effects. We will not continue distribution until every batch has been inspected and reformulated," he announced firmly. An uneasy silence filled the room until Thomas Beck broke it. "With all due respect, Ethan, Halting production now will cost millions and open the door for competitors, not to mention the impact on our stock value. Murmurs of agreement followed, and Ethan realized he was facing not just a medical crisis, but a corporate battle. He made it clear he wasn't asking for opinions. From this moment on, production of Alarix is suspended. This is an executive decision, he said, locking eyes with Beck. The director leaned back with a half-smile that barely hid his irritation. "You're making a mistake, and I hope you're ready to live with the consequences," he said, his tone carrying the weight of a veiled threat. Ethan didn't respond. He gathered the papers, shut off the projector, and left the room without looking back. Deep down, he knew this resistance was only the beginning. The stakes were far too high for his decision to go unchallenged. And if people inside his own company valued profit over safety, he'd have to prepare for a war that went far beyond the hospital walls. Meanwhile, at St. Matthew's, Lucas stayed vigilant. With no resources to help in other ways, he committed himself to observing. He spent hours sitting on a bench near reception, pretending to flip through an old magazine while his eyes tracked nurses, doctors, and visitors. He recorded everything in his own codes, using drawings and abbreviations so no one could understand if they saw the pages. That was how he spotted a pattern. A man in a lab coat, not part of the regular staff, arrived at the same time every day carrying a metal case. He never went to the ER, the general wards, only to the restricted area where Oliver had been during his first days. Lucas knew it was important, but he also knew he had to speak with Ethan before making a move at the end of the day. When Ethan returned to the hospital, Lucas approached him without drawing attention. "I think I saw someone you should meet. He comes here every day, but he doesn't seem like a real doctor," he said, handing over a slip of paper with the man's description and the time he usually appeared. Ethan read it carefully, feeling a chill run through him. The investigation had just gained a new piece and possibly a new threat. He glanced at his son, now sleeping more peacefully, then back at Lucas. "Tomorrow, I want you to show me where he goes in," Ethan said. The boy simply nodded, slipping the note into Ethan's pocket, like someone passing along something that could change the course of events. For the first time, Ethan realized the line between protection and danger was growing dangerously thin. The next morning, Ethan arrived early at St. Matthew's. The main hallway was still quiet, with only a few nurses changing shifts and a janitor pushing a cleaning cart. Lucas was already waiting near the vending machine, hand shoved in his hose, pockets and eyes sharp, as if ready to guide someone through dangerous territory. "He should be here any minute," the boy said, glancing discreetly at the clock. Ethan kept his distance, making sure not to draw attention, while Lucas, with calculated steps, led him to a spot where they could see the hospital's side entrance. The air carried a muted tension, the kind that makes you feel something is about to happen. Within minutes, a tall, thin man in a pristine lab coat, carrying a metal case, walked through the gate. His posture was far too deliberate for a casual visitor, and his eyes avoided direct contact with anyone. Lucas nudged Ethan's arm lightly. "That's him." The man didn't go through reception. Instead, he used a badge Ethan had never seen, before to unlock a side door, disappearing into a restricted corridor. It didn't look like part of the normal flow of doctors and specialists at the hospital. Without hesitation, Ethan slipped his phone from his pocket and discreetly took a photo, capturing both the man's face and the badge. "Good catch, Lucas," he murmured. The boy only shrugged, but the glimmer in his eyes betrayed his pride. Before leaving the spot, Ethan told him not to follow the man or try to learn more on his own. "Leave that part to me. You've already helped a lot." Lucas nodded in agreement, but Ethan knew the boy's curiosity could be a problem if it wasn't kept in check. He himself felt an almost irresistible urge to trail the man immediately. but he knew he had to be more strategic. That afternoon, Ethan met Evelyn at a cafe near the hospital. He showed her the photo, and she frowned instantly. "That's Victor Lane. Officially, he's an external consultant for Medcore, but in practice, he's the one who reviews samples and tweaks formulas mid-process. He's a skilled chemist, but fiercely loyal to the company. If he's coming here every day, it means they're trying to hide something in real time, possibly altering reports before they reach the public." Ethan's stomach churned. The thought that someone could be manipulating information while patients like Oliver were at risk only fueled his determination. "If we can prove that, it's over for them," he said, and Evelyn simply nodded, already calculating the next steps. Back at the office, Ethan called Northbridge Global's executives together once more. This time, his tone was even more unyielding. "Not only is production suspended, but all dealings with Medcore are under immediate review. I want a full audit of every transaction and every technical report." Thomas Beck, visibly irritated, tried to argue that a complete severance could lead to multi-million-dollar lawsuits. "So what?" Ethan replied, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to silence the entire room. "No settlement is more expensive than human life. Anyone who wants to challenge that can do so outside this company." The message was clear. They were either with him or they were out. Still, he knew the internal pressure wouldn't stop. Some executives would rather see the truth buried, which meant any wrong move could turn into a direct attack against him. At the hospital, Oliver was showing clear signs of improvement. The fever had broken, and his appetite was returning. Ethan took the opportunity to talk to his son about Lucas. "He's been a big help, but I need you to promise that if he tries to get involved in something risky, you'll tell me." Oliver agreed, but added, "He's not doing it for money, Dad. He just wants to help. I think he knows what it feels like to be alone in a fight like this." That hit Ethan deeper than he cared to admit. He knew that, at heart, Lucas saw something of himself in Oliver, maybe the vulnerability of not having someone to protect. And that only reinforced Ethan's sense that, somehow, this boy was already part of something far bigger than he realized. That night, Ethan received a message from an unknown number. "If you keep pushing, you won't be able to protect your son." He stared at the screen for a few seconds before blocking the number and deleting the message. There was no point in reacting impulsively. He needed hard proof, a plan that would not only expose Medcore, but also protect everyone involved. Meanwhile, in the small room where he lived, Lucas finished jotting down the last details of the day in his notebook. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to be at the center of something far larger than he could imagine, and his life, like Ethan's and Oliver's, was about to change forever. 2 days later, Ethan realized the investigation was unsettling more people than he'd anticipated. From early morning, the conference room was filled with attorneys and board members, all pressing him to reconsider the production halt. The arguments were the same: financial losses, risk of losing contracts, market instability, but there was something in their tone that revealed it wasn't just business concern. It was fear. Fear that if the truth came out, there'd be nothing left to rebuild. Ethan stood his ground, repeating that this wasn't a temporary decision and that the priority was a full investigation. "There's no negotiation when lives are at risk," he said, locking eyes with Thomas Beck, who seemed more nervous with every meeting. The tension was mounting, and he knew that from now on, every step he took would be closely watched by those who wanted the matter buried quickly. Meanwhile, Evelyn kept pushing deeper into evidence gathering. Through contacts in the research sector, she managed to pull information about Victor Lane's visits to the hospital. Records showed he was entering specific areas where patients in experimental treatments were admitted, yet there were no formal protocols for those visits. Stranger still, Some of the samples he collected vanished from the lab before results were officially recorded. Ethan studied the documents carefully, feeling his suspicions solidify. There was deliberate tampering to hide the drug side. Effects. If we expose this, they won't have anywhere to run, he said. But Evelyn warned him. That's exactly why they'll fight with everything they've got to stop you. At the hospital, Oliver continued recovering, but Lucas was paying even closer attention to anything unusual. That morning, he told Ethan he'd seen Victor in a quick conversation with a man who didn't look like a doctor or hospital staff. They left together through the side door. The man was carrying a thick envelope, he described. Ethan jotted down every detail but told the boy not to follow or try to learn more on his own. You've already done plenty, Lucas. Leave the rest to me. The boy agreed, but Ethan knew his curiosity and sense of justice would be hard to contain. The bond between them was stronger now, and he could feel that without saying it. Lucas trusted him as someone who wouldn't leave him behind. Late that afternoon, Ethan got a call from an internal company line, but the voice on the other end didn't identify itself. Stop this, Preston. Keep pushing, and you'll go down with your reputation. Medcorp has more allies than you think. He answered with silence, waiting for the caller to hang up. When Evelyn heard about the threat, she suggested increasing security, but Ethan chose to keep his routine unchanged to avoid drawing suspicion. Even so, he couldn't ignore that they were being watched. Even some Northbridge employees who had once seemed loyal were now keeping their distance, avoiding any direct association with him. The next day, Ethan arranged a discreet meeting with an investigative reporter he trusted. He handed over part of the information they had and asked for absolute discretion until they had irrefutable proof. If you publish anything now, they can strike back and destroy the case's credibility, he explained. The journalist understood, but warned that leaks were likely, given the number of people involved. Ethan knew time was working against them, and with each passing day, the risk of evidence being destroyed grew. That's why he instructed Evelyn to prepare a complete dossier, ready to be released all at once, with no chance of pulling back. That night, when he went to visit Oliver, he noticed Lucas was quieter than usual. When asked what was wrong, the boy said his grandmother had taken a turn for the worse in the past few hours, and the doctors were concerned. They said her condition got a lot worse today, he said, his voice tight. Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder, telling him he'd help in any way he could. As much as he was in the middle of a corporate battle, he knew Lucas's pain was real and immediate. And in some way, he felt that looking out for him was part of what he needed to do. When he left the hospital that night, Ethan noticed a black car parked across the street. The engine was off, but the interior lights were on, and two silhouettes sat inside, watching him. There were no visible plates. He didn't react, simply walked to his car and drove off. But he knew the net was closing in. This was no longer just about business or justice. It was personal now, and it involved the safety of the people he most needed to protect. The next morning, Ethan woke to a string of encrypted messages from Evelyn. Attached was a final compilation of medical reports, lab samples, and internal hospital access logs, meticulously organized and ready to be handed over to the district attorney. This was no longer just a collection of suspicions. It was documented proof of deliberate tampering and willful negligence. Without wasting a second, he arranged a private meeting with a trusted state prosecutor, someone experienced in public health cases who knew how to operate discreetly. In a modest office far from corporate towers, Ethan laid out every document, detailing the web of omissions tying Medcorp to Alaric's. The prosecutor, a seasoned professional, quickly grasped the gravity of it. If confirmed, the case could lead not only to civil lawsuits, but also to criminal charges. I'll need a warrant to access hospital and Medcorp files simultaneously. That's going to rattle a lot of people very fast, he said. sealing the material in a secure folder. Ethan nodded, knowing he was about to turn a quiet war into an open conflict. While the prosecutor began moving behind the scenes, Ethan returned to St. Matthew's to check on Oliver. He found his son sitting up in bed, absorbed in a board game brought by a nurse. The improvement was clear. The skin rashes had vanished, and color was returning to his cheeks. Lucas was leaning against the wall, flipping through his notebook, like someone reviewing a map before a mission. When he saw Ethan, he got up and quietly asked, "It's going to be over soon, isn't it?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before telling him the worst was nearly behind them, but they still had to be careful. He didn't mention the legal measures already in motion, but the firm set of his shoulders and the determined look in his eyes told the boy something important was about to happen. As he left the room, Ethan crossed paths with Dr. Hawley, who avoided eye contact and hurried past a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes about the tension already spreading through the hospital. By mid-afternoon, the prosecutor's response came faster than Ethan expected. The warrant was approved. Within hours, a discreet team, accompanied by officials from the prosecutor's office, entered St. Matthew's to seize documents and copies of patient files tied to the suspicious cases. Evelyn, on site, coordinated the collection before any department had time to organize its records. In the lab, they found clinical trial logs with altered dates and results that didn't match the reports officially sent to MedCorps. Each finding strengthened the certainty that this wasn't error or coincidence, it was calculated manipulation. The operation moved quietly, avoiding unnecessary attention, but whispers began spreading among nurses and doctors, creating an atmosphere of expectation and unease. Ethan watched from a distance, planning his next moves, aware that the first strike had just been made. The quiet didn't last. By early evening, a local news site posted a short, vague note: prosecutor investigating possible serious failure in widely distributed medication from a Harborview-based company. While no names were mentioned, anyone familiar with the case could make the connection. Ethan's phone began buzzing nonstop, reporters looking for statements, shareholders demanding answers, and old acquaintances offering advice on damage control. He ignored them all, focusing on coordinating with Evelyn and the prosecutor for the next step. Lucas, noticing the unusual stream of calls and the weight in Ethan's expression, ventured a remark. "They already know, don't they?" Ethan replied with only a slight nod, unwilling to burden the boy with more than he already carried. Meanwhile, the hospital corridors were growing tenser by the hour. Doctors exchanged wary glances, and some staff who once greeted Ethan now avoided him. Lucas, whose daily routine gave him free passage through different wards, began picking up on whispered conversations between people who rarely worked in the same area. When he reported this to Evelyn, she stressed that every new detail should be documented, but without direct confrontation. The boy agreed, though his expression revealed his frustration at not being able to do more. For him, this fight was already personal, not only because of Oliver, but for every child he'd seen in the hospital with similar symptoms. Ethan saw that quiet determination with a mix of pride and concern, fully aware that without Lucas, he might never have uncovered what was really happening. That night, as Ethan left St. Matthew's, the prosecutor gave him a direct update. With the evidence collected and the first forensic results in, there was enough to officially halt the use of Alarix in the hospital. The order would be delivered to the administration the next morning, along with instructions to preserve all remaining batches and samples. It was a significant win, but Ethan knew he couldn't let his guard down. If the news had already leaked locally, national and even international pressure would soon come crashing in. As he got into his car, he glanced out the window at the hospital lit up on the hill. Inside were the son he needed to protect, the boy who had learned to trust him, and the truth that still needed to be fully brought to light. The game was far from over, but for the first time in days, he felt the pieces were finally starting to move in his favor. The morning began with an urgent call from Northbridge's board of directors. News of the investigation had already spread far beyond Harborview, hitting the country's leading business outlets. The headquarters was in a frenzy, lawyers hurrying through the halls with folders under their arms. The public relations team locked in meetings to draft a statement, and a few directors openly discussing irreparable damage to the company's image. When Ethan stepped into the conference room, he was met with stares that shifted between hostility and unease. One of the major shareholders, visibly agitated, demanded that he temporarily step down as CEO to protect the brand. Ethan stood firm, letting them air all their accusations, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried an unyielding tone. The priority was not the company's reputation, but the safety of the people who depended on its products. He made it clear that production and distribution of Alarix would be halted immediately, regardless of the financial fallout. Some argued that such a decision amounted to an admission of guilt, but he countered that the facts and evidence spoke for themselves. Shortly after, the communications team presented a draft press release that downplayed the severity of the situation, using vague phrases like internal review and protocol assessment. Ethan rejected it on the spot. He wrote the statement himself, concise, direct, and uncompromising, announcing the permanent suspension of Alarix, full cooperation with the authorities, and a commitment to cover all necessary treatments for affected patients. Once signed, he ordered it released simultaneously on the company's social media channels and sent to the national press. Evelyn, observing everything closely, took in each deliberate move. It was rare to see an executive willing to sacrifice his own position to protect the truth. The impact was immediate. Within an hour, the announcement was on TV networks and news sites nationwide. Ethan's image framed by hard-hitting headlines. The stock market reacted sharply, shares plummeting, but he seemed immune to the pressure of numbers. At the hospital, the news reached staff first through their phones. Doctors paused consultations to read the statement. Nurses exchanged stunned glances, and patients whispered about it in the corridors. Oliver, sitting with Lucas in the cafeteria, saw his father's face appear on the TV mounted in the corner. The boy read the caption and gave a faint, proud smile. "He did it," he said simply, with the quiet understanding of a difficult choice made. Lucas felt a mix of relief and unease. He knew that move didn't end the fight, it only shifted the battlefield. Evelyn arrived minutes later, bringing confirmation from her contacts that the hospital had officially received the order to stop using Alarix. Under pressure from parents and the press, the administration announced it would fully cooperate with the investigation. That afternoon, Ethan was called back to the prosecutor's office to discuss expanding the case. It was no longer just about the hospital, and Medcore evidence suggested that other suppliers and intermediaries had profited from distributing the drug, even knowing the risks. This widened the investigation scope to other states and possibly other countries. The prosecutor warned that this new phase would be slower and more delicate, requiring stronger legal backing and protection against obstruction attempts. Ethan agreed, but insisted that the top priority remain identifying and helping every patient at risk. He made it clear he had no interest in backroom deals to soften penalties. He wanted a final outcome that left no room for the fraud to be repeated. Amid the avalanche of commitments, Ethan carved out time to return to Oliver's room. He brought a new game, one that required patience and strategy, and stayed by his son's side for nearly an hour, as if nothing outside those walls existed. Lucas came in afterward, and the three of them sat together, sharing a snack and laughing over small rivalries on the board. It was a simple moment, but one heavy with meaning. Excited, Oliver began asking when he could go home. Ethan told him it would be soon, but first, they needed to be sure every test came back perfect. The boy accepted the answer with a nod, unaware that for his father, soon depended not only on medicine but on the outcome of a war still unfolding by day's end. With the lights dimming and the hospital growing quieter, Ethan stepped outside for some air. The cool breeze helped clear his head, but also reminded him that every step from here on would be watched by the media, the justice system, and enemies who had yet to fully reveal themselves. Evelyn approached, handing him an envelope with his upcoming schedule and mentioning she'd received word that some high-level MedCorps figures were holding emergency meetings out of town. "They're going to try to protect themselves," she said in a low voice. Ethan slipped the envelope into his pocket, thanking her for everything she'd done. He acknowledged that without her and Lucas, many of the recent breakthroughs wouldn't have been possible. Evelyn, now working directly for him, maintained an extensive network of contacts within the hospital and moved freely there under formal authorization he'd requested, giving her access to strategic areas and information vital to the investigation. The news that Oliver was clinically out of danger came with the measured sobriety of St. Matthew's doctors. Stabilized test results, inflammatory markers down, vital signs steady, and clearance for discharge as soon as the final observation protocol was complete. Ethan listened in silence, absorbing each term like someone stacking bricks to rebuild a house after a storm. Beside the bed, Lucas kept his notebook closed on his lap, listening intently as if the verdict belonged to him. 2. Oliver, with more color in his cheeks, sat up a little to hear the nurses' and residents' instructions and agreed to strict follow-up appointments. Before leaving the pediatric floor, Ethan suggested they stop by the long-term care wing together, not out of formality, but because Lucas never skipped it. They rode down quietly to the coldest hallway in the hospital, where the air smelled of antiseptic and patients, and stopped in front of bed 23. Martha lay as she had for 2 years, suspended between assisted breathing and the unchanging time that had shaped her grandson's routine. Lucas stepped forward, carefully took his grandmother's hand, and in a thin voice told her Oliver would be going home soon. Oliver, in turn, softly thanked her for all she had meant to his friend. Ethan stayed a step back, attentive, understanding that visiting her before the discharge was an act of loyalty to close one of the hardest chapters of their lives. The hours that followed went to preparing for the discharge forms signed, instructions for supportive medication, follow-up schedules, contact numbers in case of complications. Oliver traded his hospital gown for a blue jacket and looked down the hallway like someone relearning how to walk beyond a mapped-out space. At the farewell, the staff let slip restrained smiles and measured relief, and Lucas watched closely, caught between pride in seeing his friend cross that threshold and the weight of knowing he himself would return to his grandmother's wing. The next day, Ethan led them both to the side exit, avoiding the commotion of the main lobby, and offered Lucas a ride to East Dockside. He accepted. On the way, they spoke of small things: the screech of seagulls, the icy wind off the pier, a dog that insisted on chasing bicycles, and in that fragile normalcy, the day came to a close. Oliver heading home under watchful care, and Lucas returning to the neighborhood he knew better than anyone. That night, when the city dimmed its lights, Ethan checked messages, organized the next steps of Oliver's follow-up, and promised himself that from now on, nothing would be lacking for the boy who had opened the door to the truth. 2 days later, before the sun broke through the harbor fog, Ethan's phone vibrated with a call from the hospital. The nurse's voice carried the careful urgency of someone following protocol. Martha's condition had crashed. Her blood pressure was dropping, her heart faltering, the team moving to ensure comfort and dignity. Ethan pulled on his coat, past Oliver still in pajamas, telling him, go with him and headed for East Dockside. Lucas was already waiting on the sidewalk, leaning against a rusted railing, eyes fixed on the damp ground. No questions were asked. They got in the car and drove up to St. Matthew's without music, without news. Only the sound of the engine and the faint rattle of cartwheels in the hospital corridors. When they reached the long-term care wing, the clock marked one of those elastic minutes that don't obey ordinary time. Martha lay as always, but something in the monitor's rhythm betrayed the end of a quiet resistance. Lucas moved to the bedside and intertwined his fingers with hers. Ethan stood on the other side, present without intruding, offering the kind of presence that says I'm here when there's nothing left to say. The staff explained, with the gentle professionalism of those who know the anatomy of goodbyes, that her body could no longer sustain the effort. The care now meant comfort, and that her passing should be peaceful. Lucas pressed his forehead to her hand and began to recount, almost in a whisper, the simple memories he kept like talismans. The smell of bread in her old oven, the way she folded warm shirts straight from the line, the quiet laugh when he made up names for the seagulls on the pier. He wasn't speaking to bring her back, but to preserve her clearly in his mind. The steady beep of the monitor slowed until it became a single, continuous tone. The nurse turned off the machines with the delicacy of a ritual, smoothed the sheet, and the silence that settled in wasn't empty. It was full of everything that had been lived. Ethan set a hand on Lucas's shoulder, steadying the weight that finally gave way. And there, between the cold metal and the white light, ended the cycle of a woman who, even motionless for 2 years, had never stopped being her grandson's. Ethan took charge of the arrangements with the precision of someone who knows how the machinery of the world works. But now put it to service of care, he handled the paperwork, called the funeral home, chose a simple, dignified coffin. White Lila Lucas's suggestion, a memory of a small garden before the illness, reserved a quiet room for the wake, and arranged discreet transportation for anyone wishing to say goodbye. He asked Evelyn to manage the practical details, shielding Lucas from the draining bureaucracy. He coordinated with Oliver on the times to be by his friend's side without turning him into a display of sympathy. At the wake, there were only a few people's softly spoken stories of a life of work and kindness. Old neighbors recalling coffee brewed in a cloth filter and advice given at the doorstep. Lucas stood beside the coffin, clutching the knitted blanket. He had inherited as a child, and when words failed, it was the texture of the yarn that kept him from unraveling. Ethan stayed 2 steps away, ready if needed. Oliver brought water, tissues, silence, each in the right measure. The farewell unfolded without rush, the way goodbyes need to if they are to hold everything at the cemetery. Harborview's wind cut through the trees and rattled old chains. The damp earth received the coffin with a low thud, and Lucas, eyes shut, chose to photograph in his mind the time before the illness, not the image disappearing before him. When the shovels returned the ground to its shape, Ethan leaned in and told him, in a tone that promised only what he could deliver, that from now on Lucas would not walk alone. He didn't speak of houses or moving, he spoke of presence, of school, of medical appointments, of regular meals, of everything that turns care into habit. Leaving the cemetery, Ethan didn't take him back to the old building. They drove in silence, and on the way he said the mansion had more than enough room and Lucas could stay as long as he wanted. The boy looked out the window for a few seconds before giving the smallest of nods. When they arrived, Oliver helped carry the small bag with Lucas's few clothes, and the 3 of them went inside together. There was no long talk, no attempt to soften the grief, only the certainty that, in that moment, being close to people who cared was what mattered most. Ethan showed him the room where he'd be staying, left the door slightly open, and assured him that, for anything, he'd be right there. That night, The distant sound of waves and the warmth of a different home were a small comfort for a heart still bleeding, but one that had begun to find shelter. The days following Martha's funeral settled into an unexpected rhythm for Lucas. Life at the mansion moved at its own pace, with schedules unlike anything he was used to, yet it carried a sense of safety he couldn't remember feeling before. In the mornings, Oliver would call him down for breakfast in the kitchen, where there were always eggs, pancakes, and bacon. Ethan would appear shortly after, sleeves rolled up, shirt neatly pressed, making a point to ask if they'd slept well, even if the answer was just a nod or a quick smile. It wasn't the kind of forced politeness Lucas had known elsewhere. These were small routines naturally finding their place. Evelyn stopped by from time to time, sometimes with dessert, other times simply to sit and talk. She and Ethan shared an easy friendship, and with Oliver, there was a quiet, almost conspiratorial way they exchanged glances and jokes. To Lucas, it was just more proof that, in this space, no one saw him as a burden. Oliver and Lucas were close in age, and that made all the difference. When they weren't exploring the garden or shooting hoops in the backyard, they'd spend hours in front of the TV, video game controllers scattered across the carpet. The competition between them was always fierce, ending in laughter, light, teasing, and quick rematches. When Ethan passed by the living room and saw them side by side, he often lingered in the doorway for a few seconds, as if committing the moment to memory. It wasn't common for him to have the house filled with young voices. Even the mansion's dog, long used to stretches of quiet, seemed livelier, curling up near the boys whenever their laughter grew louder. Slowly, the house stopped being just walls and furniture for Lucas and began to take on the meaning of home. Mealtimes became another moment that brought everyone together. Sometimes, Evelyn would arrive just in time, sharing funny stories or chatting about a movie she'd watched. Lucas, once so reserved, began joining in more, talking about school or happy memories from his childhood. Oliver, always the more talkative of the two, would add to the stories or make up little jokes to make his friend laugh. Ethan watched on, joining in when he wanted, but letting the rhythm develop naturally. There was no rush for Lucas to adapt, and that lack of pressure seemed to make it easier. Before long, there was already a quiet familiarity between them, as if they'd been living together much longer than they had. One Saturday afternoon, after hours of gaming and running around the garden, Oliver suggested they hold an official tournament, scorekeeping and improvised trophies included. Ethan joined in as the referee, and Evelyn, who had dropped by for a visit, helped organize. The afternoon brought laughter, rule debates, and a photo of the four of them together, which Evelyn later printed and gave to Lucas. He set it on the nightstand beside his bed, almost like a charm against loneliness. He didn't mention it to anyone, but that night he took longer to fall asleep, staring at the photo and feeling something he couldn't quite name, something very close to belonging. A few days later, Ethan asked Lucas to meet him in the study. The door was open, and Oliver, curious, lingered on the stairs, trying to listen in. Ethan spoke plainly but gently. He wanted to know what Lucas thought about making their arrangement official. He explained it would mean becoming his legal guardian, caring for him permanently, and that it came with responsibilities, but also the guarantee he'd always have a place to call home. Lucas took a while to answer, staring down at his hands, then asked if that meant he'd never have to move to another home again. Ethan smiled and told him yes. The silence that followed broke with Lucas saying he wanted that he'd agree, and saw no reason to wait. Oliver celebrated the news as if it were a gift for him too. Within hours, he was making plans about where they'd store their games, what movies they'd watch together, and what their first outing as three would be. The weeks ahead would be filled with legal steps and meetings with social workers. But for Lucas, the most important part had already been decided. He was no longer a guest in the mansion or someone just passing through. He was part of something that was solidifying into family. The house, already filled with the voice and footsteps of one child, now held even more life. Conversations drifting through hallways, spirited games in the living room, and the kind of small messes that color a day. Between shared meals and movie nights, one certainty grew stronger. They could face anything that came their way, knowing no one in that home would ever have to face it alone. The end. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.